reply.
Well, in this really fine and wide-ranging paper, John Keane took us from participatory democracy in ancient Athens to representative democracy in 18th century France to what he's calling post-representative democracy since the mid-20th century and finally to the problematic world of the early 21st century. In the conclusion of his paper, John urges us to democratize democracy, both in order to make a potentially dangerous and violent political system safer for the world, and to allow normatively desirable aspects of democratic culture and institutions to achieve their full moral potential. This seems to me exactly the right aspiration and for the right reasons. John links democracy with violence at its very roots, possibly, with the potential for the unrestrained use of force combined with hubris. He makes this linkage through democracy's recognition of the contingency of human action. Democracy is not, he reminds us, inevitable. It is not invulnerable. Democracies can be born and democracies can go out of existence. I think that's actually a very important and indeed a very humbling thought. Democracy promotes the recognition that the actions we undertake as individuals and as collectivities are not foreordained, are not the manifestations of a natural order of things, but rather they are the result of our own willful choices. Democracy allows us to see more clearly that our choices to act in certain ways are far from inevitable and that we might, in other circumstances, act differently. With this recognition of choice and the contingency of action comes the potential to connect our desires with ends in ways that are systematically effective and thus potentially, but not inevitably, more violent, more destructive, more driven by hubris and unrestrained desire. Now, this seems to me to be exactly the right sort of metaphysics. The pragmatism and experimentalism that we associate with democracy is, I think, built into the very fabric of democratic culture. What John Keane has done is to demonstrate for us, both logically and historically, how pragmatic democratic attention to contingency can, in some circumstances, lead to very bad outcomes. Yet he also, and rightly, warns us to resist the notion that democracy is essentially violent. As sharers in a democratic culture, we should be able to recognize that democracy's tendency for violence remains a matter of historical contingency. Democracy, once violent, may indeed become otherwise. It's really our choice. What I would suggest is that John's very persuasive account of the contingent relationship between democracy and violence would be even more persuasive, first by adding to it an explanation of why certain democracies develop such great capacity for action, such extraordinary power, and why it is that only certain democracies, manifesting certain institutional and cultural forms, achieve that level of capacity and power. And finally, under what conditions enhanced democratic capacity is turned either to vicious or violent ends or to productive and nonviolent ends. In short, what makes some democracies so successful, and why do hyper-successful democracies sometimes, but not always, use their success for such nasty purposes? Well, John focuses our attention on accountability and on transnational forms for governance in what he's calling this post-representative era. And I think his account suggests that in the movement of democracy from ancient Athens to revolutionary France to the post-World War II era, there actually is a gain, that something has been gained in each step. And yet, I would suggest that perhaps something might be lost. Not irrevocably lost, but if we say that Athens and its participatory institutions are gone and over, France and its representative institutions are gone and over. We are in a world of post-representative democracy in which we need to build all new institutions. Perhaps we'll be losing things that we really can ill afford to lose, losing institutional innovation or the capacity for institutional innovation that we could actually make use of. Well, I suggest that we cannot really begin the urgent project of democratizing great power democracies like the U.S. until we understand the roots of democratic powerfulness. The key, I would suggest, is distinctive democratic institutional design that successfully aligns what is good for the individual with what is good for the collectivity, and does so by promoting fairness in respect to competition, openness in respect to access, trust based on common knowledge of shared social preferences, and the active sharing of useful knowledge across diverse social networks. Sustaining this sort of democratic institutional design, however, requires in turn a broad commitment to individual liberty, including the freedom to question authority, which John has brought our attention to so forcefully in this paper, to question authority and its institutional forms. But also, democracy requires equality of opportunity and a respect for the dignity of persons. Democracies that get all this right, the institutional side of it and the value side of it, get it all right, are immensely, or can be immensely effective. They become highly capable and therefore potentially extremely powerful because they balance the capacity for constant innovation with deep social learning. Now, sometimes that capacity for innovation and learning is turned towards imperial projects, the ones that John has focused on today. But at the same time, that same capacity for innovation and learning can be turned to non-imperial projects. We've been talking largely today about Athens in the imperial 5th century BC. We might see a very different picture in the 80 years of Athenian democratic history that follows the end of the Peloponnesian War, a period characterized by a great growth of wealth, a great development in culture, great art, great architecture, and yet no empire. There are post-imperial potential for democracies that learn how to indeed democratize themselves. The problem, of course, and this really is John Keene's essential point, is that the growth of democratic capacity and power sometimes does lead to hubris and unrestrained desire, and thus to the destructive employment of power as violence. The destruction, as John pointedly reminds us, is not limited to democracy's external enemies and rivals, but entails the alienation of former friends and allies, and ultimately the collapse of internal liberty, equality, and dignity on which democracy is based. In the face of technological innovations leading to what John calls overkill, the collapse into incoherence of a hyper-powerful democratic power is indeed horrifying to contemplate. I speak here as an American and as a member of the world community, we must not allow that to happen. So the goal of democratizing democracy is indeed among the most important challenges facing the global community in the 21st century. John Keene's timely and passionate and learned paper has brought home to us the extraordinary salience of that issue for our own times. I offer him the suggestion that knowledge-based institutional design, typical of direct democracy in the Athenian style, but potentially adapted to representative forms of national democracy and the kinds of accountability-focused forms of post-representative democracy with which he is concerned, offer him the suggestion that these kinds of knowledge-based institutional designs might be an essential source of democratic power in the hope that it may advance his very urgent project of assembling the interpretive tools necessary for us to begin democratizing democracy, and then to getting the job done before it's too late. Thank you.
You're all totally sick of me, and I know it's been a long day. I agree. What can I say? I think probably the devil lies in the details, and there are two broad points you made that I thought were very helpful for my case, and they happen to be problems that I'm also wrestling with this large history and future of democracy. I think in a slightly coded way, you asked, why are some democracies more successful than others, or to bring it to the question of empire, which has been long neglected in reflections on democracy. The last time there was a serious discussion about that was circa 1900, and I think there's been a lot of anti-imperialist bashing, but I think I hoped that I illustrated something of the great complexity of the relationship between democracy and empire. And the question is, how is it that democratic empires appear? And I don't quite know how to answer that in very brief terms, except to say that it's a highly contingent process. It is, you would say, it is partly bound up with this internal endogenous learning mechanism. The very openness of democracies encourages the sharing of opinions and perspectives and tends to promote innovations. Also, I put it more in the flip side version, it also prevents follies, projects that are stupid, ideas that are daft, nonsense that's nonsense. And in this sense, democracy is an early warning device and enables it. That's undoubtedly part of the story of the rise of these three empires. But every historian knows that there's a deep contingency with each of these empires and their rise. And there are simple things like that are hugely important. The fact that the new American Republic is the first successful and only successful revolution against Britain using British ideals. And it rather enjoyed a geopolitical security, more or less, despite British revenges and French hostilities and so on, that enabled it to become great. I can't elaborate any more than that, except to say that I agree with you completely that we need better to understand the conditions that promote the rise of superior democracies, because that might help us better to tame them. There is no doubt, I think, that at least as I've tried to write in my account of the rise of the American empire, that all those institutional learning processes, those knowledge-based institutional designs that you spoke of in the 19th century are very remarkable about the American Republic. It's the most successful 19th century experiment in democracy. By contrast, in Europe across the Atlantic, it largely fails. And it's a very fraught, embattled, violent process. The first non-violent transfer of power, multi-party system is born there. The first popularization of the language of democracy in the Jacksonian period. Men get the vote quite early by world standards. There is a civil war, a complication. It's a struggle over two conflicting definitions of democracy. It's one of the perhaps first democracies to survive a power clash about what democracy means and to come out of it somehow stronger. And it's also the democracy where the first critiques of party bossing happen, and so the invention of muckraking journalism, the introduction of recall. I mean, these are all American innovations of the 19th century, and they are part, I think, no doubt, of this tremendous sense of the internal capacity to act on the world, and they are part, paradoxically, of the rise of empire. The second point, I think, we come back to Athens. Athens and the modernity of Athens. What can we learn from this model? You want to say that the great secret and the perennial importance of Athenian democratia is that by engaging citizens in direct participation within the institutions, that the production and sharing of knowledge was possible. I think with the caveats that I mentioned about 5 hours ago, I agree. And I would say that this point is perhaps not clear, but I would say that notion is useful, suitably handled, to the innovations that I have in mind that are really strikingly new. What is participatory budgeting? A gift of the Brazilians to the world of democracy, and now practiced in some 300 cities, and the numbers grow quite quickly, and in whole states like Kerala in India. What is participatory budgeting? Which is a mechanism outside the party system, not dominated by parties, where citizens and/or representatives have an input into the formation and introduction and institutionalization of an annual budget, and blowing the whistle on it when it's stupid or felt to be unjust. Isn't that an example? Or take, for example, the birth of regional parliaments. It is a miracle that the European Parliament has been born. It is a new device, cross-border parliament, and it works, and it should be stronger. It has in some parts of the Union a strong following. Or think about human rights. I think it can't be overemphasized, this marriage between democracy and human rights. It is something entirely new. Although the origins of rights are much older, the marriage takes place just at the end of World War II. And if you look at the drafting group, Eleanor Roosevelt's drafting group, there are only 4. Great democratic innovations are typically made undemocratically. You see that figures like Charles Malik, the Lebanese drafter, René Cassin, the French drafter, and a Canadian, and so on, and a Chinese scholar and a poet. I mean, they all thought that this could kickstart a new method of monitoring power, of circulating knowledge of abuses of the body and of rights, and they, for a time, expected states to be the guarantor of this, but Charles Malik already in early 48 gives speeches, for example, to the Rotarians of the United States saying it's probably a lost cause, and so if it's going to happen, it will have to happen at the non-governmental level. And it has come to pass. I mean, these are new institutional innovations in the history of democracy, and they seem to have this effect. My point was that we are rather sleepwalking into the future. I'm really surprised how my own discipline has let us and you all down. There's hardly any theorization of this post-representative democracy. A lot of talk of third waves, but it's not the same thing. It's rather a distraction. And I'm also, this was an appeal not only to wake up to what is fresh and new and potentially very valuable, and making democracy somehow richer and more complex and certainly cross-border, but I also made an appeal to say that the most important and powerful democracy in the world could well be a threat to this, or it has a track record partly of being responsible for its birth. The UN Declaration of Human Rights would not have been possible without it. The European Union would not have happened without the Marshall Plan and military protection. Democracy in Japan, and so on and so forth, would not have been possible. So the question is whether there will be a resumption of these institution building, knowledge-based new institutional designs, as you put it, championed by the United States. I think it's a great political question. And I don't quite know what to recommend to how to do it. You know, should we send troops to the United States? Probably not. Of course, 2008 will be a watershed year. Remember that if you read Stephen Grobard, the Harvard historian, this current trend of the administration is deep-seated. I mean, the rise of the imperial presidency goes back to FDR, the only president to serve 4 terms. The rules have now changed. So the election of Hillary Clinton may not change very much. The question is whether there is this knowledge-based institutional learning process possible within the presidency. I think that's the question. And how to do that, I think, is a matter for politics.
Well, it's fascinating as I'm sorry, we don't have time for questions. It's fascinating as our session has been. We're now well and truly over time. And thank you very much for coming along and being here for over 2 hours. I now ask, please, for conference delegates and invited guests to make their way to the conference reception as soon as possible. But before you leave, please join with me once again in thanking our speakers.